A cold wind rustled through the city streets as David walked cautiously, tapping his white cane against the pavement. The sounds of hurried footsteps, distant car horns, and muffled conversations surrounded him, yet he felt isolated in his own world of darkness. He had been blind since childhood, and over the years he had learned to navigate the world without sight. But nothing had ever made up for the loneliness that clung to him like a shadow. David had no family left. His parents had passed away years ago, and without siblings or close friends, he had learned to rely only on himself. He spent most of his days walking through the city, taking in the familiar sense of fresh bread from a nearby bakery, the damp smell of rain-soaked streets, and the occasional fragrance of flowers from the park. But no one ever really noticed him. To the world he was just another blind man walking alone. One day, as David made his way to his usual park bench, he felt an unusual presence nearby. He could hear the flutter of wings, the soft rustling of feathers, and then a distinct, sharp caw. He turned his head slightly, listening carefully. A crow. He had heard crows before, but this one sounded close. Too close. Curious, he continued walking, but the sound of wings followed him. The crow wasn't just nearby, it was deliberately staying with him. David frowned. He reached his bench and sat down, his hands resting on his cane. The crow landed beside him, its talons lightly tapping against the wooden surface. Then, something unexpected happened. A small, solid object dropped onto his lap with a soft clink. David ran his fingers over the object, feeling its cool, round shape. A coin. A tiny chuckle escaped his lips. "Did you just give me a coin?" he murmured, half amused, half puzzled. The crow cawed again, almost as if confirming his suspicion. David smiled for the first time in what felt like weeks. "Well, thank you, I guess." He lifted the coin and placed it in his pocket. He had no idea why a crow would bring him a coin, but the small act of kindness, if he could even call it that, made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not just curiosity but warmth. A strange kind of companionship. For the next few days the crow continued to follow him. Every morning, as David left his small apartment, he would hear the familiar sound of wings flapping above him. Whenever he sat on his bench, the crow would land beside him, sometimes bringing small trinkets, buttons, pebbles, or even tiny pieces of shiny foil. It was as if the bird was trying to communicate with him, to form some kind of bond. And David found himself talking to the crow. At first it was just small comments. "Back again, huh?" he'd say with a smirk. Or, "What have you got for me today?" But soon the words turned into full conversations. "You know, people think I can't feel eyes on me, but I can," David said one evening, tilting his head towards the crow. "I know when someone's staring too long. And I know when they're avoiding me." He sighed, gripping his cane. "But you don't care that I'm blind, do you? You just sit here dropping random things on my lap." The crow cawed in response, hopping closer. David chuckled. "Maybe you're just a thief, and you don't know what to do with all your stolen treasures." The crow let out a softer noise, almost like a hum. David's smile faded slightly. "Or maybe you just see me. Really see me." For the first time in years he felt like he wasn't invisible. One afternoon, as David prepared to leave the park, he hesitated. Normally he would head home, heat up a simple meal, and spend the rest of the evening in silence. But today, as he stood up, he found himself speaking softly. "You coming?" The crow flapped its wings and soared ahead, leading the way. David didn't know why, but he smiled as he followed. Days turned into weeks, and David's bond with the crow grew stronger. The once lonely walks through the city now felt different. The rhythmic tap of his cane was accompanied by the soft flutter of wings above him, a comforting reminder that he was no longer truly alone. The crow had become more than just a curious bird, it had become his silent companion, his unseen eyes in a world of darkness. David had never named the crow, yet he spoke to it as if it were a trusted friend. "You know," he mused one morning as he walked his usual path, "people must think I'm crazy talking to you like this." He chuckled. "But I don't really care. You're the only one who actually listens." The crow cawed in response, as if agreeing. That day, David decided to take a different route. Instead of heading straight to the park, he chose to wander through a new part of the city, an area he hadn't explored in years. He could smell fresh pastries from a bakery nearby, and the faint sound of a street musician playing the violin drifted through the air. It was a beautiful day, and for the first time in a long while, David felt at peace. But then something strange happened. The crow, which had been quietly flying above him, suddenly let out a sharp, urgent caw. David stopped. He turned his head slightly, listening. "What is it?" he murmured. The crow flapped its wings wildly, circling above him. Its caws grew louder, more frantic. It wasn't just making noise, it was warning him. David's grip on his cane tightened. His heart pounded. He had learned to trust his instincts, and right now, every fiber of his being told him something was wrong. Then he heard it. A low rumbling sound, growing louder by the second. The sound of tires screeching. A car. Coming fast. David barely had time to react. He took a step back, his mind racing, but before he could move any further, something yanked his sleeve. A sharp pull. Not from a person. From above. The crow. Its claws gripped the fabric of his jacket, tugging with surprising strength. It was pulling him away from the street. David stumbled backward just as a car sped past him, missing him by mere inches. The rush of air from the vehicle nearly knocked him off balance. The sound of the tires skidding echoed in his ears, followed by a blaring horn that faded into the distance. For a moment, everything was still. David's breath came in short gasps. His hands trembled as he clutched his cane. He hadn't even heard the car coming. He had been seconds away from stepping into its path, and the crow had saved him. Slowly, he turned his head toward the sound of fluttering wings. The crow had landed on the ground beside him, watching him intently. David let out a shaky breath. You pulled me back," he whispered. His fingers brushed over the sleeve of his jacket, feeling the tiny punctures left by the crow's claws. Proof that it hadn't been his imagination. A lump formed in his throat. No one had ever saved him before. No one had ever cared enough to. Yet this bird had. David knelt down, resting his hand on the pavement. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I mean it. You saved my life." The crow cawed softly as if understanding. David wiped at his eyes, overwhelmed. He had spent years believing he was alone in this world. But maybe he wasn't. Not anymore. David couldn't shake the weight of what had happened. That night, he sat in his small apartment, running his fingers over the tiny punctures in his jacket sleeve, the only proof that he had come seconds away from death. His mind replayed the moment over and over. The sound of the speeding car, the forceful tug, the frantic caws of the crow. If not for that bird, he wouldn't be sitting here right now. He exhaled slowly, his chest tightening. Why had the crow saved him? He wasn't sure how long he sat there, lost in thought, but eventually exhaustion took over. He drifted into an uneasy sleep, haunted by dreams of screeching tires and outstretched wings. The next morning, as he stepped outside, the familiar sound of fluttering wings greeted him. David tilted his head upward. "You're here," he murmured, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. The crow landed lightly on his shoulder for the first time, its tiny claws gripping his jacket without hurting him. David chuckled. "Guess we're past personal space now, huh?" The bird let out a soft caw, almost as if amused. That day something changed. David had always been careful with his surroundings, always hyper-aware of every step he took. But now he felt something different, a kind of trust he hadn't known before. The crow stayed close as he walked, occasionally flying ahead before returning to his side. And every time David hesitated, uncertain of his surroundings, the crow would caw, guiding him. A silent language formed between them. A soft caw meant he could continue walking forward. A sharper caw meant to stop. And if there was an obstacle in his path, the crow would gently tug at his sleeve. It was like having a guide, one with wings. David's life, once filled with isolation, now had purpose. One evening, as he sat on his park bench, he spoke softly. I used to think I didn't matter much. That if I disappeared, no one would even notice." The crow tilted its head, listening. "But you saw me," David continued. "And for some reason you chose to stay." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small piece of bread. He had never fed the crow before, afraid of scaring it away. But today he held out the offering. The crow hesitated for only a second before hopping onto his arm and pecking at the bread, taking small bites. David smiled. "I guess that means we're really friends now." The crow cawed, then flapped its wings and landed back on his shoulder. David laughed. For the first time in years, he felt lighter, like the weight of his loneliness had finally begun to lift. And for the first time in his life he felt truly seen. Days passed, and David and the crow became inseparable. Wherever he went, the bird was always nearby, watching, guiding, protecting. It was more than just a companion now. It was a part of him. The city no longer felt as cold and empty as it once had. Even in the silence of his blindness, he felt the world differently, with a presence by his side that he could trust. But fate was not done testing him. One afternoon, David was making his way through a familiar street when he heard it again, the low growl of an approaching vehicle. Only this time something was different. The usual sounds of traffic were chaotic, but this was worse. This was fast, reckless, out of control. The crow let out a sharp, frantic caw. David froze. The sound of screeching tires tore through the air, echoing against the buildings. And then a shout. "Watch out!" But David couldn't see, couldn't tell which way to move. He felt the rush of panic rise in his chest. His fingers gripped the handle of his cane so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The crow, sensing the danger before David could react, took flight. A sudden force slammed into David, a push, strong and urgent. He stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat just as a car sped past him, missing him by inches. The sound of its tires skidding violently against the pavement filled the air. A crash. A sharp gasp from onlookers. David's heart pounded. He struggled to catch his breath, his body shaking. But something was wrong. The crow. Where was the crow? David turned his head toward the street, dread sinking into his bones. He couldn't see, but he heard the murmur of voices, the whisper of concern. Then a silence that screamed louder than any sound. "No," he breathed. His feet moved on their own, his hands fumbling in the air as if reaching for something, someone. His crow. He dropped to his knees, his hands touching the cold pavement. And then, his fingers brushed against something soft. Feathers. A lump rose in his throat. He swallowed hard, but it did nothing to stop the wave of grief crashing over him. He felt the tiny rise and fall of the bird's chest, weak, unsteady. David's breath hitched. "No, no, no," he whispered. His hands trembled as he cradled the crow gently, as if his touch alone could keep it here. The bird let out a faint, broken caw. David choked back a sob. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice shaking. Again. The weight in his hands grew still. And just like that, his guardian was gone. The silence that followed was unbearable. The world, once filled with the soft flutter of wings and the knowing caws of his friend, now felt emptier than ever. David clutched the small, lifeless body against his chest, tears slipping down his face. He didn't care who was watching. He didn't care about the noise of the city around him. For the second time in his life he had lost someone he loved. But this time it had saved him. David sat on the curb, cradling the crow's still body in his hands. The city moved around him, cars honked, people talked, life continued. But for him time had stopped. A gentle hand touched his shoulder. "Sir, are you okay?" a woman's voice asked softly. David could barely nod. His throat was too tight to speak. "I saw what happened," the woman continued. "That crow, it saved your life." David swallowed hard, trying to find words. It was my friend." The weight of those words hit him like a tidal wave. His friend. His protector. His only companion. Gone. Tears slipped down his face, and for the first time in years he let himself grieve in front of someone. The woman sat beside him. "That's not just any crow, is it?" David shook his head. "No. It was everything to me." A long pause. Then softly she said, "I run a wildlife rescue center. I know how special crows are. How deeply they can bond." David wiped at his face. "It saved me twice." She exhaled, her voice full of admiration. "It must have loved you a lot." David's fingers gently stroked the crow's feathers. "And I never even gave it a name." He felt a lump rise in his throat. Why had he never thought of that? It had been there for him every day. Always watching, always protecting. Yet he had never once spoken its name. The woman placed a hand over his. "Would you like to give it one now?" David thought for a moment. Then in a quiet voice he whispered, "Guardian." The name felt right. A name that carried meaning. A name that would never be forgotten. Later that evening, David gave Guardian a proper resting place beneath a tree in the same park where they had spent so many days together. His hands traced the earth, his heart heavy with grief. He sat beside the small grave, listening to the wind rustling through the branches. He wished he could hear one last caw. One last flutter of wings. But all that remained was silence. And yet, in that silence, David made a decision. He would not let Guardian's sacrifice be in vain. The days after Guardian's passing were the hardest David had faced since losing his sight. The absence of the crow felt like a void that nothing could fill. The city streets felt different now, quieter, lonelier. But something had changed inside him. Sitting in the park one afternoon, he ran his fingers over his cane, deep in thought. Guardian had saved his life twice. What? Could have flown away. It could have left him alone like the rest of the world had. But it didn't. It stayed. And now it was gone because it had chosen to protect him. David clenched his jaw. He couldn't let that sacrifice mean nothing. The thought burned in his chest. He had spent too long simply existing, lost in his own darkness. But Guardian had taught him something: he wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, there were others like him who needed to be reminded of that. That night, David sat at his small kitchen table, his fingers hovering over his laptop's keyboard. It had been years since he'd written anything. He used to love storytelling back when his world was still full of color. But after the accident, he had given up. Now, though, the words inside him felt too heavy to keep in. He took a deep breath. Then, slowly, he began to type. There was once a crow who saved a blind man's life. Over the next few weeks, David poured his grief, his love, and his memories of Guardian into his writing. He wrote about their friendship, about the lessons he had learned, about how a single bird had changed his life. And for the first time in years, he felt purpose again. His story spread faster than he ever imagined. People shared it, commented on it, told him how much it moved them. Some even reached out with their own stories about animals that had saved them, about finding hope in unexpected places. One day, a journalist contacted him. "I read your story," she said, "and I think the world needs to hear it." David hesitated. He had spent so long hiding from the world. But then he thought of Guardian. Would the crow have wanted him to stay in the shadows? To live in fear and isolation? No. It had risked everything to keep him safe. David straightened in his chair. He would not waste that second chance. "Yes," he finally said. "I'll share it." The interview aired on television and quickly gained attention. People from all over the country reached out to David, moved by his story. Strangers sent him messages. Some thanked him for sharing, others shared their own experiences of loss, resilience, and the unexpected friendships they had formed with animals. But one message stood out. It was from the woman he had met that day, the one who had seen Guardian's sacrifice. "I run a wildlife rescue center," her message read. "I'd love for you to visit. I think you might find something special here." David hesitated. He hadn't been around animals since Guardian. He wasn't sure if he was ready. But deep down he knew this wasn't about him anymore. It was about honoring Guardian's memory. A week later, David stepped into the rescue center. The sounds of birds filled the air: chirps, flutters, soft caws. The woman greeted him with a warm smile. "Come with me. There's someone I want you to meet." She led him to a quiet corner, where a young crow sat perched on a branch. It let out a soft caw, tilting its head as if studying him. David felt his chest tighten. He held out a hand, unsure what to expect. To his surprise, the crow hopped closer. Then, with delicate precision, it nudged its beak against his fingers. A shiver ran through him. It wasn't Guardian. But it was something. Something new. Something waiting to be written into his story. As days passed, David kept returning to the rescue center. He learned about birds, about how they were cared for, about how many of them like him had faced hardships and still found a way to survive. One evening, sitting under the same tree where he had buried Guardian, he smiled softly. He wasn't alone anymore. And maybe he never had been. David's story spread across the world. It became more than just a tale of loss. It became a story of hope, resilience, and the unexpected ways life gives us second chances. And as for the young crow at the rescue center? One day, it perched on David's shoulder just like Guardian once had. David chuckled, running a gentle hand over its feathers. "I think I'll call you Hope." And for the first time in a long time, he felt exactly that. Hope. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and comment below. Have you ever experienced an unbreakable bond with an animal? Tell us your story, we'd love to hear it. And if you believe in the power of kindness and second chances, consider supporting your local animal rescue centers. A small act of love can change a life forever. Subscribe for more heartwarming stories that remind us of the deep connections we share with the world around us.